Armageddon is a term that has worked its way well into our culture. It's the end of the world, at least the end of the world as we know it. And you would think that that was something we'd want to know something about. In fact, you'd think it's something we'd want to know a lot about, the end of the world. And so John brings up the topic in Revelation chapter 16, and we turn our attention to it now. Armageddon is that battle or battles at the end of the tribulation where Jesus comes back. It's his second coming, and he defeats the nations, defends Israel, and sets up his kingdom. It's known as Armageddon, and we find it in Revelation 16, but it's not the only place that we find it. So let's turn our attention there. But to do so, let's first clarify our terms. And the first thing we have to make sure we remember is that we're talking about the second coming of Jesus, the coming of the Messiah. We're not talking about the rapture. We've made that point many times. The rapture pertains to the church. It can happen at any time. The rapture is when the church meets the Lord in the air. It's found in 1 Thessalonians 4. The second coming is the predicted return of the Messiah to the earth at the end of a 7-year period of tribulation. And he comes to defend Israel and to set up his kingdom. That's the period we're talking about now. It's called the second coming of Jesus. And it's found not just in Revelation 16, but we're also going to look at Zechariah chapter 14, and then we're going to skip over to what's known as the sheep and goat judgment in Matthew 25. But I'm ahead of myself. Let's look at the text. John tells us in Revelation 16, beginning in verse 17, that the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It is done." So let's review. The seventh bowl judgment is the same as the seventh trumpet judgment, which is the same as the seventh seal judgment. So this is the very end. This is finally the end of God's patience. And so now we're talking about the end of time. It's the end of the world. There were flashes of lightning, rumbles, peals of thunder, and a great earthquake, such as had never been seen since man was on earth. So great was that earthquake. Keep that in mind. We're coming back to that. The great city was split into 3 parts. I'm going to argue that that's Jerusalem. But here, it's going to be called Babylon. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and God remembered Babylon the Great. And we'll talk a lot about that in the next chapters. He remembered Babylon the Great to make her drain the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath. And every island fled away, and no mountains were to be found. And great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from heaven on people, and they cursed God for the plague of the hail, because the plague was so severe. This is God pouring out wrath from heaven onto the earth. This is the battles of heaven and earth finally coming together. God has had enough. He's judging the earth. He's about to judge Satan's kingdom as well. And we are now at what John has called the battles of Armageddon. I know that because in verse 16, we had already seen that the nations were gathered together at a place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. That's Revelation chapter 16, verse 16. So we've seen that the second coming is what we're talking about. It's when Jesus returns. So now let's set some context. Go to Zechariah chapter 14. Now, Zechariah is one of the minor prophets, but he's talking directly about these same events. And it's called the Day of the Lord. Again, terminology. Day of the Lord includes the 7 years of tribulation plus 1,000 years of the reign of Christ over the earth in peace. Day of the Lord includes tribulation plus peace. Usually, it's referring to the tribulation, but it also includes peace. Zechariah is talking about Day of the Lord. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. Notice, Zechariah is talking to Israel. And he's talking about Jerusalem in particular. That's an important point. We're going to hold on to that. For I will gather all of the nations against Jerusalem. This is the time that John is talking about. All the nations are gathering at Jerusalem to destroy Jerusalem. I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Notice what happens. That's when the Lord kicks in. This is a cosmic battle like never before. The Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. Now, God himself mounts a war from heaven. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mountain shall move northward and the other southward. That opens up prophetically what would be called the Valley of Jehoshaphat, and the Lord will judge the nations there. You shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azal, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Notice the earthquakes. We'll see that again. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Notice the angels are coming with him. This is cosmic battle. This is heaven and earth going to war. On that day, now he's talking about the rest of the day of the Lord. On that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost. There shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but in evening time there shall be light. It's an extended period of time. On that day living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, half to the western sea. It shall continue as summer and in winter, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. On that day the Lord will be one, and his name one. So you've got this period of battle. We'll call it Armageddon. Jesus will reign, and it'll be an extended period of time and of peace. That's what Zechariah is talking about. John is talking about the beginning of that. He's talking about these battles of Armageddon. Now, before we go back to there, let's go to what Jesus said about it, which is found in Matthew chapter 25. Now, in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus had been asked by his disciples, tell us about when your kingdom is going to come. And he tells them what it's going to be like at the end time. And he talks about when he comes, this final judgment, when he's going to gather the nations and judge them. He's talking about the exact same time. Matthew 25, verse 31, it's called the sheep and goat judgment because he gathers the nations. The sheep, those who believed in him as manifest by their deeds, will enter into his kingdom. The goats will be cast to hell. When the Son of Man comes, this is verse 31 of Matthew 25, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, notice the cosmic warfare. Jesus is coming with the angels. And he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations. And he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will place the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Enter this reign. Now, we're going to talk about that in future videos. And then those on his left who did not manifest faith in him by their deeds, on those on his left, verse 41, he says, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And with that, Jesus ushers those who believed in him into his earthly reign, also known as part of the day of the Lord that Zechariah was talking about. There's a 7-year tribulation period, battles of Armageddon. Jesus comes back. He defends Jerusalem. He destroys the nations. He judges the nations. And he allows those who believed in him to enter into his earthly reign, his 1,000-year reign, which we haven't seen yet, coming videos. And he establishes kingdom of peace on earth in fulfillment of his covenants to Israel. There's a lot we haven't covered yet. The battle or battles of Armageddon is the very end of God's judgments through the tribulation, opening up the beginning to Jesus' earthly reign. That's a lot. That's what happens. The nations are gathered together, but there's a demonic element to this like you can't believe. I just talked about the earthly part. The nations of the world are gathered against Israel. Do you ever notice why Israel was so persecuted and has been persecuted throughout history? That's because of the covenants that God gave to its forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, that there would be a king and a kingdom, and that these would be a people that would bring the Messiah. He would bring his king through this people and establish his kingdom among the nations. The devil knows that. And that's why there's been so much persecution and will continue to be persecution. But one day, according to Zechariah, Israel will look upon the one that they have pierced. They will recognize their Messiah. One day, and we will see this in the future videos, they will play host to all the nations coming to Jerusalem to pay homage to Jesus, the Messiah. The day has not yet come. But until that day, you can count on the demonic persecution and the global persecution. And church, we can count on the same thing. The devil knows who his enemies are. But until that day, it's our task to make disciples of all the nations, to proclaim the good news of the gospel. We live in a war zone. And when we proclaim peace, we proclaim the peace of the cross of Christ, which is kind of an irony because the cross is a brutal place of death. It's a brutal place of the death of Jesus Christ. And it's through the shed blood of Jesus Christ that we actually have peace with God. That's the message that we proclaim, and there's no other way. But there's another part to this war and this Armageddon. And I've been building towards this point the whole way through Revelation. It's not just battles on earth, but there's this two fronts to the war. There's this battle that takes place in heaven with this devil who has tried to usurp God's kingdom. And that comes to a head at Armageddon as well. And so we need to turn our attention to that next. And we'll do that in the next video. Okay, so now this is kind of like the extra credit. Not really. There's two parts, there's two sides to this Battle of Armageddon. Now I say battle and I say battles. It could be a series of battles. And this whole period of eschatology, this is called future events, has been battered around by Bible scholars for many years. And it's all over the place, to be honest with you. And so we're going to try to pilot a course through this, but it's up to you as a Bible student to figure your way through all of these theological buoys. But we're going to pilot a course today. And what I'm going to show is that there is a heavenly battle going on and an earthly battle going on. Whether it's a series of battles or a singular battle is really immaterial for what I'm trying to say. It's probably a series of battles, but that it's at the end of the tribulation is really the point we hold on to. This is the culmination. This is God. He's finally had enough, and he's bringing judgment and heaven in on earth. So we saw in the last video that the nations of the world are coming together at Jerusalem. They want to destroy Jerusalem as God's people. And Jesus himself comes back, stands on the Mount of Olives, destroys the nations, defends Israel, splits the Mount of Olives, and then will separate the sheep from the goats and will establish his kingdom. But there's a heavenly side to this too. Remember, there's a war with Satan. And that's by far, I think, the more elusive but also interesting part. And it comes to, part of it can be revealed in the fact that John tells us in Revelation 16:16 that these demons gather these people together, these nations, at a place called Armageddon. So let's start with the text. Revelation 16, verse 14. He sees this Antichrist and false prophet and dragon, and he sees these unclean spirits like frogs coming out of their mouths. For they are demonic spirits performing signs, and they go abroad to the kings of the whole world, so gathering the leaders of the world, to assemble them for battle in the great day of God Almighty, Armageddon. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be seen exposed. Now, verse 16 is the key. And they assembled them at a place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Then he drops it there. So these demons are gathering these kings together in battle. So that right there tells you it's a cosmic battle, not just an earthly battle. Remember, the devil has been cast down to earth. This is his last stand. So you know this is not just an earthly issue. This is the devil making his last stand on the planet. So the question I want to ask is, where is this? Now, historically, Bible scholars will say, well, this is at Megiddo, which is a site in northern Israel overlooking the Jezreel plain, so that if you were to come from the Mediterranean across the Jezreel plain, you'd have to go past Megiddo. You'd be looking down at the Jezreel plain. You'd be going due west. Then you could go down the Jordan River. Excuse me. You would go down the Jordan River and you would head due south. And then once you got to Jericho, you would go upward towards Jerusalem. So it's a strategically located place. That's the classic position of Megiddo. And so Armageddon would take its name from Megiddo, and so therefore the battles of the end times would be at Megiddo. However, there's a couple problems with that position, and this is not a hill to die on, so to speak, but one of the problems with it is that when you read the rest of Revelation 16 here, it sounds like it's talking about Jerusalem, not Megiddo. We've already been to Zechariah 14, which is definitely talking about Jerusalem. We've been to Matthew 25 and the sheep and goat judgment, and that's definitely talking about Jerusalem. And it's not talking about battles on the Jezreel plain. So that's one of the problems. Another problem has to do with the actual name Mountain of Megiddo, which we'll see in a second. Megiddo is not a mountain. It's an artificial mound, which was created by centuries and millennia, actually, of civilizations. It's a tell, and it goes all the way back to Chalcolithic and Paleolithic times, which is like the Stone Age. There's thousands of years BC of civilization upon civilization building on one another until you've got this mountain, which really isn't even a mountain. There's 20 some odd levels of excavation that have been done over the years. And so that has built it up. So it's not even a mountain. So these are part of the problems with looking at Megiddo. Now, what I'm about to say is also in part built on scholarship of scholars like Michael Heiser, who's recently written a book called The Unseen Realm. So if you want to check out some of that, look at his work. But there's others that have written about it as well. So let's dive into the core of it. And you're just going to need a little patience with me. So let's look at Armageddon. John tells us that the name of the place in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Now, Greek doesn't have a letter H. It has a little apostrophe. And so the Greek text has an apostrophe there, so it's actually Harmageddon. And it's not even a Greek word anyway. He's telling us it's a Hebrew word. So Harmageddon is made up of two words, Har and then the Mageddon part. The Har means mountain. So that's why you get Mount of Megiddo or Mount whatever. So we know that it's a mount. That's the Har part. Now it's the last part of it, which is the interesting part, the Megiddon. That's created by some Hebrew consonants. And if you notice, there's a G in it, Megiddon. I know, bear with me. This is really interesting to some of you. Trust me. There's only one way to say G, or the hard G, in English and in Greek, G. But there's two ways to do it in Hebrew. In fact, as English speakers or Greek speakers, we can't even say it. I've tried like all week long to try to imitate it, and it sounds so funny, I'm not going to do it on tape. I can actually do it, but it's all the way back here in the throat. It's actually written differently. But if you were to try to write it in English, or write it in Greek, the only way it comes out is with a G, which is what John does. He gives it a gamma. And so when it comes out, it looks like Megiddo. And so we just assume it's Megiddo. But if you use the other G and you put it back into the Hebrew, lo and behold, another translation, instead of being the Mount of Megiddo, which we just said is not a mount, it's a tell, it comes out to be the Mount of the Assembly. Now that is a very different issue. Let me translate it this way. They assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called the Mount of the Assembly. Now all the lights go off. Where have we heard that before? Exactly. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 13. You might recognize that Isaiah 14 is the great passage where the devil is pictured falling from heaven. Let me read it. Pick it up in verse 12. How you have fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. How you've been cut to the ground, you who laid the nations low. Well, what did the devil do? Here's what he said. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. Remember, stars of God are angels, so the devil is mounting a coup. I will set my throne on high above the angels. I will sit on the what? Mount of the Assembly. There's the term. I will sit on the Mount of the Assembly in the far reaches of the north. What's he trying to do? He's trying to take over God's throne. I will sit on the Mount of the Assembly. What is John saying? They're going to bring these demons into this place, this Mount of the Assembly. That seems like a really interesting illusion. Now we know from Zechariah 14, we know from Matthew 25, we know that Jesus is coming back to Jerusalem. And here he uses a different term. He uses, I think, what would be the spiritual side of this, the Mount of the Assembly. What's the implication? On the heavenly side of this thing, God has given an eviction notice to the devil who's tried to take over God's Mount of the Assembly. Here on earth, Jesus is coming down and waging war in Jerusalem to recapture his city, to prevent the nations from taking his city. But in heaven, eviction notice to the devil. You're not taking over my throne. You're not taking over my Mount of the Assembly. He's already been booted out of heaven. And so here we go in the text where in these last battles, God's wrath is being poured out on earth, but also in heaven. I go back to a verse I've quoted over and over and over. This time I'll take you there and have you read it with me, which is Exodus 12, verse 12. The pattern for many of God's judgments came in the Exodus plagues. And in the 10th plague, in Exodus 12:12, God says, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night. I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. What does that verse tell us? It tells us that when the Lord went to war for Israel, he was simultaneously going to war against the demonic host that was seeking to keep his people as slaves, seeking to destroy his people. So what's happening in Revelation 16? All of the kings of the earth are gathering together by the demons to Jerusalem to destroy God's people once again. What does the Messiah do? He comes to Jerusalem to defend his people, not just against all the nations of the earth, but against the demons who inspired them to come and destroy his people. So what does he do? He comes and destroys the demons as well, and he serves them an eviction notice at a place called the Mount of the Assembly. It's an interesting interpretation. Would I bet my theological socks on it? No, I wouldn't. However, it makes more sense than anything else I have read before. Now, when something hinges on a linguistic spelling like that, I have to say, that's really interesting. But it's not just a linguistic spelling. It's that, it's Zechariah 14, it is Matthew 25, and frankly, there's a few other more passages that I haven't covered, which you can find in Heiser's book if you want to go read that. It's in some pretty technical footnotes. But I have walked away convinced because I have been building towards there's a battle that takes place in heaven and a battle that takes place on earth. So what have I said and why does it matter to me today? I've been saying that there's a battle in heaven and a battle on earth that come together in Revelation. That the battles of Armageddon, whether it's plural or singular, come at the end of the tribulation. It's the end of the world as we know it. It's the culmination of God's judgment. This is it. The seventh seal is the seven trumpets, is the seventh bowl. The seventh bowl has been poured out. Jesus now comes at the second coming. He comes with judgment, and he comes to set up his kingdom. Revelation from this point will now talk about the destruction of Babylon the Great, Satan's kingdom. It's interesting that we're in Jerusalem when this happens. I'll talk more about that as we go forward. This is it. This is the end. This is God has finally had enough. That's what I've been saying. But the battle is two-front. Now, Paul will say that, and we quote it all the time. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, authorities, spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. It's Ephesians chapter 6. We say it. We don't live it. And we live in a period of time right now when if we can't see that it's a spiritual battle, how blind can we be? The events that we see happening all around us. Do you know why there's a spiritual blindness? Because there's a spiritual devil. There is a rebellion that has taken place in the heavenlies that has darkened the minds of mankind. In fact, that's what the Bible tells us in 2 Corinthians 4:4. The God of this age, that's the devil, has blinded the minds of unbelievers so they cannot see the light of the gospel, which is the glory of Christ. Watch the news. I don't care what channel you watch on the news. And I don't care what persuasion it is. There is going to be some form of deception if it's not filtered through the truth of the light of the gospel of Christ and the Bible. There is a God of this age, that'd be the devil, and he has blinded the minds of unbelievers. No matter how many times we try to fix this planet, it's not going to work without the cross of Christ. There is no justice, there is no peace, there is no fixing without Jesus. And there's only one way to have peace with God. And it's not going to be by sitting down and talking it through. It's going to be by kneeling before the cross of Jesus Christ and saying, I believe in you, I have sinned, forgive me. I receive the gift that you've given to me. Can't reason people to the cross. We can show that it's reasonable, but can't reason people. Now, how do you cut through that? That's the role of the Holy Spirit, who convicts the world of sin and righteousness and judgment. But we do have what I call a golden arrow. It cuts through all of the apologetics. It cuts through all of the lies. And that golden arrow is the love of Jesus Christ. It's designed to hit a certain hole in every person's heart. And that hole is a hole of love. Every single person is looking for that. That's the one we carry. But you know what? To shoot that arrow, that golden arrow of love, that means to shoot that arrow, you have to die. Let me say that again. To shoot that arrow of love, you have to die. You have to die to self. You have to die to privilege. You have to die to those things that make you feel like, oh, I'm right, you're wrong. You have to be willing to put someone else before yourself. You have to be willing to be patient. You have to be willing in an argument not to prove that you're right. You have to be willing to show that Jesus loves them. That doesn't mean you have to buy a lie. It doesn't have to mean that you can't stand up for truth and righteousness. But it means that in love, we have to show the way to the cross because there's no other way. We have to stop trying to be like the world. We have to stop trying to fix the things on our own. And if we truly were that way, we would be on our knees in prayer. Our only hope is the cross.